Air France 447, do you copy? Air France 447, please respond. The desperate voice of the Brazilian air traffic controller echoed through the night, met only by the deafening silence of the Atlantic Ocean. At 2:14 a.m. on June 1, 2009, what began as a routine red-eye flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris became one of aviation's most haunting mysteries. Flight 447, with its 228 souls aboard, simply vanished from radar screens without a trace, disappearing into the darkness of the equatorial Atlantic like a ghost ship swallowed by an endless void. The evening of May 31, 2009, painted Rio de Janeiro's Galeão International Airport in hues of orange and crimson as the sun dipped below the horizon. Air France Flight 447 sat majestically on the tarmac, its pristine white fuselage gleaming under the terminal lights. The Airbus A330-203, registration FGZCP, had been delivered to Air France just 4 years earlier, representing the pinnacle of European aviation engineering. This particular aircraft had logged over 18,870 flight hours across countless oceanic crossings, establishing itself as a reliable workhorse of the Air France fleet. Captain Marc Dubois, 58, settled into the left seat with the confidence that comes from logging over 11,000 flight hours. His weathered hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, each switch and button as familiar as the keys of a piano to a master musician. Tonight, however, fatigue weighed heavily on his shoulders after a series of demanding flights, and he had already made the decision to rest during the cruise portion of the journey, entrusting the aircraft to his capable co-pilots. First Officer Pierre-Cédric Bonin, 32, occupied the right seat, his youthful enthusiasm balanced by solid training and 2,936 hours of flight experience. Though relatively junior compared to his captain, Bonin had demonstrated exceptional skill during his tenure with Air France, earning respect from senior pilots and ground crews alike. Beside him, First Officer David Robert, 37, brought additional experience with his 6,047 flight hours, serving as the pilot not flying and providing crucial support throughout the journey. The passenger cabin buzzed with the typical pre-flight energy as 216 passengers from 33 different countries settled into their seats for the overnight journey. Among them were families returning from Brazilian vacations, business executives heading to important meetings in Europe, and tourists eager to experience the magic of Paris. Children pressed their faces against the windows, marveling at the airport's busy ground operations, while their parents checked watches and settled in for what they expected to be an uneventful 11-hour flight. At 7:29 p.m. local time, Flight 447 pushed back from Gate E at Terminal 2, beginning its taxi toward runway 28L. The evening air was thick with humidity, typical of Rio's tropical climate, but weather conditions were favorable for departure. Captain Dubois completed his final checks, while the aircraft rolled slowly through the maze of taxiways, the city lights of Rio twinkling in the distance like scattered diamonds against black velvet. As Flight 447 lined up on the departure runway, the 3 Pratt & Whitney engines spooled up to take off power, their combined 230,000 pounds of thrust preparing to lift the heavy aircraft into the night sky. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, climbing rapidly through Rio's humid air as it began its journey toward the northeast, following the established air route that would take it across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The initial climb proceeded normally as Flight 447 established itself on the UN 873 airway, one of the main aerial highways connecting South America to Europe. The passengers, now airborne, began settling into their overnight routines, reclining their seats and preparing for sleep during the long journey ahead. Many had no idea they were embarking on what would become one of aviation's most intensively studied accidents. As the aircraft climbed through 35,000 feet and established its cruising altitude, Captain Dubois reviewed the flight plan with his co-pilots. The route would take them across the equator and through the intertropical convergence zone, an area known for severe weather and turbulence. Weather radar showed scattered thunderstorms along the planned route, a common occurrence in this part of the world, where opposing air masses create unstable atmospheric conditions. The flight progressed normally for the first 3 hours, with the aircraft maintaining its assigned altitude and airspeed, while autopilot systems managed the complex task of oceanic navigation. Passengers dozed in their seats or watched in-flight entertainment, unaware that they were crossing some of the most remote waters on Earth. Below them, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, its dark surface broken only by the occasional white cap or distant ship's lights. At approximately 11:00 p.m., as the aircraft approached the midpoint of its journey, Captain Dubois made the decision to leave the cockpit for his scheduled rest period. This was standard operating procedure for long-haul flights, allowing the captain to remain fresh for the approach and landing in Paris. He briefed First Officers Bonin and Robert on the weather conditions ahead, noting the presence of convective activity that would require careful navigation. The transfer of command was routine, with Bonin assuming the role of pilot in command. The weather situation ahead was becoming increasingly complex as Flight 447 approached the intertropical convergence zone. Massive thunderstorm cells towered to altitudes exceeding 50,000 feet, creating an aerial obstacle course that required careful navigation. The aircraft's weather radar painted an ominous picture of intense precipitation and turbulence directly along their planned route. First Officer Bonin began making subtle course corrections to avoid the worst of the weather. At 2:10 a.m. UTC on June 1st, Flight 447 was cruising at 35,000 feet and 275 knots, its autopilot systems maintaining stable flight through the darkness. The aircraft had been airborne for over 4 hours, and many passengers were deep in sleep, trusting in the technology and crew expertise that had safely carried millions of travelers across these same waters. The Airbus A330's sophisticated fly-by-wire system was functioning normally, constantly making minute adjustments to keep the aircraft stable and on course. Suddenly, at 2:10 a.m. and 5 seconds, the cockpit was pierced by a sharp chime as the autopilot disconnected without warning. The distinctive sound sent an immediate jolt of adrenaline through First Officer Bonin, who had been monitoring the aircraft's progress through the weather. In the span of just a few seconds, the sophisticated Airbus A330 transformed from a stable, computer-controlled aircraft into a manually flown machine, requiring immediate pilot intervention. The initial cause of the crisis was deceptively simple, yet catastrophically effective. Ice crystals, formed in the extreme cold of the high-altitude atmosphere, had begun accumulating on the aircraft's pitot tubes. These pencil-thin sensors, protruding from the aircraft's fuselage like metallic whiskers, are responsible for measuring the critical parameter of airspeed by detecting the pressure of air flowing into them. As ice blocked these sensors, they began providing erroneous airspeed information to the aircraft's flight management computers. First Officer Bonin instinctively pulled back on the side-stick controller, an action that caused the aircraft to begin climbing above its assigned altitude. This seemingly logical response to the autopilot disconnection was actually the beginning of a series of control inputs that would ultimately doom Flight 447. The Airbus A330's fly-by-wire system, designed to prevent pilots from exceeding the aircraft's flight envelope, was now receiving conflicting information from its sensors. As the aircraft climbed rapidly through 35,000 feet, its airspeed began to decay at an alarming rate. The laws of physics are unforgiving at high altitude, where the thin air provides less lift and engine power is reduced. By pulling back on the controls and maintaining a steep climb attitude, First Officer Bonin was unknowingly trading airspeed for altitude, pushing the aircraft toward an aerodynamic stall. First Officer Robert, monitoring the situation from his position, began to recognize that something was seriously wrong with their flight situation. The engine parameters showed normal operation, but the flight instruments were displaying conflicting and impossible readings. Airspeed indications varied wildly between the three independent systems, with some showing increasing speed while others showed decreasing values. The master warning system, activated with its distinctive two-tone chime, followed immediately by multiple caution and warning messages flooding the electronic centralized aircraft monitor. Red and amber lights illuminated throughout the cockpit as the aircraft's computers detected various system anomalies and exceedances. The cacophony of alerts created an overwhelming sensory environment for the two pilots trying to diagnose and correct the situation. Captain Dubois, resting in the crew quarters behind the cockpit, was awakened by the unusual sounds of multiple warning systems and increased engine noise. His years of experience immediately told him that something significant was happening, and he began making his way forward to the cockpit. The journey from the crew rest area to the flight deck took precious seconds, time during which the aircraft's condition continued to deteriorate. At 2:11 a.m. and 40 seconds, Flight 447 reached its maximum altitude of approximately 38,000 feet, far above its optimal performance ceiling with the current weight and atmospheric conditions. At this extreme altitude, the aircraft was operating in what aerodynamicists call the coffin corner, a dangerous flight regime where the margin between stall speed and maximum operating speed becomes razor-thin. The aircraft's angle of attack had increased dramatically as First Officer Bonin continued to hold the nose up in response to the confusing instrument readings. Unknown to the crew, this high angle of attack was causing the smooth airflow over the wings to separate, creating the aerodynamic condition known as a stall. In a stall, the wings lose their ability to generate lift effectively, and the aircraft begins to descend despite the pilot's efforts to climb. Captain Dubois burst through the cockpit door at 2:11 a.m. and 43 seconds, immediately sensing the tension and confusion that permeated the flight deck. His experienced eyes quickly scanned the instrument panels, trying to make sense of the conflicting readings and multiple warning messages. The situation was unlike anything he had encountered in his extensive flying career, with instruments showing impossible combinations of altitude, airspeed, and vertical speed. As the captain attempted to assess the situation, the aircraft had already begun its descent from the unsustainable altitude it had reached. However, this descent was not controlled flight, but rather the beginning of a deep stall from which recovery would prove impossible given the crew's actions and understanding of their situation. The aircraft's nose remained high despite its descent, creating a falling leaf motion that is characteristic of a stalled aircraft. The confusion in the cockpit was compounded by the intermittent nature of the pitot tube icing problem. As the aircraft descended into warmer air, the ice began to sublimate, temporarily restoring normal airspeed readings to some instruments. This created brief moments where the crew thought they might be gaining control of the situation, only to have the readings become erratic again as ice reformed or other system anomalies manifested. First Officer Bonin continued to maintain back pressure on the side stick, a control input that was actually preventing recovery from the stall. His training had emphasized that altitude was safety, and his instinctive response to pull back on the controls seemed logical, given the confusing circumstances. However, this action was precisely the opposite of what was needed to recover from the stall condition. The aircraft stall warning system activated repeatedly, its distinctive cricket-like sound filling the cockpit as the flight management computers detected the wing's inability to generate sufficient lift. However, the intermittent and sometimes contradictory nature of these warnings, caused by the unreliable airspeed data, made it difficult for the crew to trust the information they were receiving. As Flight 447 continued its uncontrolled descent through the night sky, passengers began to sense that something was wrong. The unusual motion of the aircraft, combined with changes in engine sound and the activation of seatbelt signs, created anxiety throughout the cabin. Flight attendants, trained to remain calm in emergency situations, began securing loose items and preparing for potential turbulence, though none could have imagined the true severity of their situation. Captain Dubois, now fully engaged in trying to understand and resolve the crisis, began questioning his first officers about their control inputs and the aircraft's configuration. The communication between the three pilots became increasingly urgent as they struggled to interpret the conflicting instrument readings and decide on appropriate corrective actions. The stress and confusion of the situation made clear communication challenging as each pilot focused on different aspects of the rapidly evolving emergency. At 2:14 a.m. and 28 seconds, approximately 4 minutes after the initial autopilot disconnection, Flight 447 was descending through 16,000 feet at an impossible angle of attack. The aircraft's computer systems, designed to protect against dangerous flight conditions, had been rendered ineffective by the unreliable sensor data and inappropriate control inputs. The fly-by-wire system was operating in alternate law mode, where many of the normal protections were unavailable. The ocean surface, invisible in the darkness below, was approaching with terrifying speed as Flight 447 descended at rates exceeding 100 feet per second. At this point, even if the crew had correctly diagnosed their situation and initiated proper stall recovery procedures, the altitude remaining would likely have been insufficient for recovery. The aircraft had passed through what aerodynamicists call the point of no return. In the final moments, as radar contact was lost and radio communications ceased, the crew's voices became increasingly desperate as they realized the gravity of their situation. The cockpit voice recorder captured their final words as they struggled to understand and respond to conditions that seemed impossible to comprehend. Captain Dubois' last transmission, a prayer-like utterance in French, reflected the human reality behind this technological failure. At 2:14 a.m. and 28 seconds UTC, Air France Flight 447 impacted the surface of the Atlantic Ocean at a nearly vertical angle, traveling at approximately 107 knots vertically and 60 knots horizontally. The impact forces, estimated at over 40 times the force of gravity, were far beyond what any human body could survive. All 228 people aboard perished instantly. Their lives ended not by any single catastrophic failure, but by a series of relatively minor problems that cascaded beyond the crew's ability to control. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Where moments before there had been the sound of engines, the chatter of radio communications, and the voices of crew and passengers, now there was only the endless whisper of Atlantic waves. The ocean, indifferent to human tragedy, accepted its victims without ceremony or acknowledgement. Floating debris would eventually mark the impact site, but for now, the vastness of the South Atlantic held its secrets. The loss of Flight 447 sent shockwaves through the aviation industry and the global community. Air France found itself at the center of an investigation that would take years to complete and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. The families of 228 victims, representing 33 nationalities, began their own journey of grief and searching for answers that would prove as challenging as the physical search for the aircraft's wreckage. The search and rescue operation that followed became one of the largest and most expensive in aviation history. Ships and aircraft from multiple nations scoured an area of ocean larger than many countries, looking for survivors who could not exist, and clues that seemed impossible to find. The ocean's depth and the remote location made this an unprecedented challenge that would test the limits of marine technology and international cooperation. It would take nearly 2 years before the wreckage of Flight 447 was finally located on the Atlantic seabed, resting broken and silent in the abyssal depths. The recovery of the flight recorders in 2011 finally provided investigators with the detailed information needed to understand the complex sequence of events that led to the tragedy. The revelation that the accident was caused primarily by pilot error in response to a relatively minor technical malfunction shocked the aviation community. The analysis of the cockpit voice recorder revealed the confusion and miscommunication that characterized the crew's response to the emergency. Despite their extensive training and experience, the pilots had been unable to correctly diagnose and respond to a situation that, while unusual, should have been recoverable with proper actions. The accident highlighted critical gaps in pilot training regarding manual flying skills and stall recovery procedures. In response to the accident, aviation authorities worldwide implemented sweeping changes to pilot training requirements, emphasizing manual flying skills and upset recovery training. Airlines were required to provide specific training in high-altitude stall recognition and recovery, ensuring that future pilots would be better prepared to handle situations similar to those faced by Flight 447's crew. The memory of Air France Flight 447 lives on, not only in the hearts of those who lost loved ones, but also in the safety improvements that emerged from the tragedy. Every pilot who receives enhanced stall recovery training, every aircraft equipped with improved pitot tubes, and every safety procedure updated to reflect the lessons learned from this accident represents a form of memorial to the 228 people who perished in the South Atlantic. If you found this examination of Flight 447's tragic final moments informative, please consider subscribing to our channel for more in-depth analyses of aviation accidents and the lessons they teach us. Your engagement helps us continue producing content that honors the memory of those lost while educating others about the ongoing quest for aviation safety.